Okay, let's get going. Let's get going. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us as we kick off what to us is an important platform for conversation. We are going to be celebrating Africa Day tomorrow. We've been celebrating Africa Month, but we've also been thinking about the state of the continent and where our collaborators and our fellow Africans are. And the situation in Sudan has been incredibly heartbreaking to experience. And it's been incredibly heartbreaking to not see it within our media and within the conversations as much as it should be. We really hope that this series, which we've titled Let's Talk About Sudan, and we will be rolling out over the next few months, will help us to reach and connect to each other, but also it will help us to understand what's happening in Sudan and why it is so important as South Africans to understand why what's happening to Sudan is linked to where we find ourselves in South Africa 30 years into our democracy. Last month we celebrated 30 years of democracy, and we also marked a year of the war in Sudan. And it's kind of crazy to think about where we are in relation to time, in relation to a post-colonial moment and our post-apartheid moment, and have all this work around repair, or these cycles around despair and then repair and then despair again. We thought about this topic of the consequences of unfinished revolutions, because as South Africans in 30 years of what was our perhaps somewhat revolution, or maybe not quite to that extent, we are still left with so much that has not been resolved. And we worry a lot around, if we do not resolve these issues, we will never get to experience repair. We at the foundation, well, first of all, I don't think I introduced my name. My name is Ntombenhle Shezi, and I am the Advocacy and Communications Manager at the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. We work on a program that is entitled Advocacy for Societal Healing. And what this means for us is we want to make the spaces, whether we are reaching out online, whether we are in person, whether we're thinking through creative methodologies, to have the very difficult and uncomfortable conversations that are needed for us to think about what does it mean to heal, and what does it mean to repair. And the question of justice, what does it mean? What does justice mean? And what does the pursuit to democracy mean? So we are going to be in conversation with three panelists who will help us to have this conversation and meditate over these different thoughts. And I believe they will illuminate so much around how South Africa and Sudan are really connected in more ways than we know. So I would love to introduce our first speaker, Raja Makawi, who is a researcher, editor, and an activist. Raja is a British Sudanese researcher and, as mentioned, has worked greatly as an editor and activist. She currently edits the African Arguments series and is a researcher on peace and conflict at the London School of Economics. Raja has also written for international publications, including Al Jazeera and Africa as a Country. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Raja. Thank you so much. Our next speaker, who you will see, is Luvano Ntuli, who is an investigator. Apologies, I see that the spotlight is on Ismail, but Luvano Ntuli is an investigator who is based here in South Africa and who works for Open Secrets. She holds an honors degree from the University of Cape Town and has specialized in justice and transformation work. Luvano is currently reading for her MPhil in the same specialization, and has worked as a teaching assistant in the Political Studies Department at UCT, as well as a researcher for the African Transitional Justice Research Network. Luvano's research interests are primarily around settler colonialism, gender justice, and transitional justice. And Luvano has done a lot of work around researching and thinking into South Africa's role currently, role of businesses in Sudan. Thank you for joining us, Luvano. Thank you. We are also joined by Ismail Kushkush, who is a journalist who has contributed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Atlantic, Granta, The Nation, Associated Press, and more. He was based in Khartoum, Sudan for 8 years, and for 2 separate 3-month periods, he was acting bureau chief for the New York Times in East Africa, based in Nairobi. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to just start the conversation with some kind of questions that help us think about where we're at the moment before we do open it to the audience. And we really hope that you will be curious as the audience joining us today. And we hope you will also engage us, because I believe some of your questions will also help us to think deeply and reflect on this issue that we're trying to tackle this afternoon. So I suppose my first question, Ismail, is for you. We would like to know and get a better understanding around what is happening in Sudan currently, and how do we get here? How did we get to this moment?
Well, first, thank you for organizing this panel. Yeah, it is important to bring the African dimension to this discussion. You know, many of us Sudanese commentators have been on many Western platforms discussing this, but having an African dimension to this discussion is important. As we celebrate and commemorate Africa Day on the 25th, I'm reminded by a speech that Thabo Mbeki gave in Khartoum in 2011. I was covering that speech. This was a few days before the referendum on the independence of South Sudan. That the view of Ghana as the first independent African nation south of the Sahara, despite the fact that Sudan became independent a year before, January 1st, 1956, was due to the view that Sudan's independence was always seen as something as incomplete, that its decolonization was incomplete. Few months before Sudan became independent, war broke out in the southern part of the country, and which would lead eventually, decades later, to the separation and independence of South Sudan. So that view of Sudan's incomplete independence has always been there. Before getting into the current war, I think it's important to understand it as a part of, or an episode of a cycle, a vicious cycle of civilian and military rule in Sudan. As I mentioned, Sudan became independent in 1956 from what was known then as the Anglo-Egyptian joint British-Egyptian rule on Sudan. Since 1956, Sudan had witnessed 18 military coup attempts, the highest in Africa. 3 of them were successful in bringing about military rule. 3 military interventions that sided with popular uprisings, revolutions in the country, brought about civilian rule that eventually failed to bring about full democratic rule. This tells you that the challenges to, in governing Sudan and trying to come to a formula where Sudanese can agree on some sort of democratic rule, I mean, has always been there. So the December 2018 revolution, it really was the 3rd popular uprising in modern Sudanese history. It was there were immediate triggers to the revolution, but also a general background to the revolution. The government of Omar al-Bashir had been in power for close to 30 years. It wasn't the first time that there was a popular uprising against the government of al-Bashir. There was in 2011, in 2012, 2013, and even before that. And also we can think of the armed rebellions in different parts of the country as expressions of dissent against the central government. What made the December 2018 and into 2019 revolution, I think, unique was in the way it organized. It brought about, again, it reintroduced the important role of trade unions. One coalition that played a key important role was the SPA, the Sudanese Professionals Association, which was a independent association of various trade unions, independent of the government-sanctioned trade unions, that was able to bring people of different political backgrounds and organize the streets, along with other factors, the tech savvy nature of the organizing, the security consciousness of the organizers. I think discontent in Sudan, I think, had reached a boiling point after 30 years, that the streets were no longer willing to accept the status quo, and that eventually led to the army siding with the popular uprising and removing Bashir. That led to a series of negotiations between the civilian forces and the military. This didn't mean that the military was immediately willing to accept turning power over to civilians. I think the first expression, the first episode in military refusal to hand over rule to the civilians was the June 3rd massacre. The massacre of Sudanese sit-in protesters in front of the army headquarters that led to the death the killing of more than 120 Sudanese citizens, and the disappearance of many, and the rape of many. But it eventually led to and pushed to an agreement between civilian forces and the military, and the agreement to a transitional period. Any transitional period, especially when formed by coalition of various political forces, including political parties, I mean, it was bound to have challenges. But I don't think the military establishment in Sudan, which were composed of really of two main elements: the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces. The rapid support forces was a paramilitary that the army had created in the early 2000s, out of the Janjaweed, which became notorious for their acts in Darfur. The willingness of the military to actually turn over to civilian, I think, was always something that many were skeptical about. But in the end, there was a transitional period that was established with many challenges. And I think out of these challenges, there were really three main issues that really led to the war that broke out on April 15th. One was the committee that was established to dismantle the remnants of the Bashir regime. As I mentioned, the removal of Bashir didn't really mean the removal of the apparatus of the National Congress Party. It was still present in government institutions. That, I think, was always seen as a threat to the military establishment. Also, a committee that was established to inquire and to investigate the atrocities that happened on June 3rd, along with other atrocities that have happened, I think, and to bring about accountability and justice to the families of the victims. That was also, I think, one of the main issues that where we saw military resistance to any real handovers to civilians. And third, and I think this is really what sparked the April 15th war, was security sector reform. and the idea of merging the rapid support forces into the army. The rapid forces over the years became a independent military economic power, headed by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, popularly known as Hemeti, that saw itself as a rival to the official army. So when the war broke out on April 15th, in Khartoum, you really had five armies. Yeah, you had the official army, you had the rapid support forces, you had the armed forces of various rebel groups that had signed an agreement a year before, and also were in the process of this security sector reform. The idea of having five armies in the capital, I think, was bound sooner or later, to lead to the clash. But now, since the April 15th conflict that broke out between the army and the rapid support forces, this has led to the displacement of 8 million Sudanese, the highest in the world today, 1 million of them as refugees abroad. The official number of death is 15,000. That is the number that the UN gives. It is probably much higher. There are doubts about these numbers, the ability to count, given the situation on the ground, in the lack of electricity, internet disruptions, gaining information. So the number is much more, probably much more higher than it is. But that is where we are today. 8 million displaced, at least 15,000 people have been killed.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that, and sort of like bringing us to this moment. I mean, when you talked about the speech that Thabo Mbeki makes and the idea of the unfinished decolonial moment, the one thing that we want to really go into is the role of colonial violence and colonization in both South Africa and Sudan. Different, but we can probably pose similar questions, to both. That is something we're going to make time to talk about in another webinar, but we also acknowledge that even where we are in South Africa is definitely something that goes way beyond apartheid and the end of apartheid, as we often kind of stop the conversation around apartheid and not really go into the history of colonialism and colonial violence. So it was very interesting to hear you say that and to just think about it in the context of South Africa as well. I want to go back to the moment of the transition, and Raja, maybe you can help us sort of understand what happened. Now we know how we got here, but we just want to flesh out a little bit more that moment, which was supposed to be a moment of transition. And I suppose there were aspirations to then use that moment to think about what the right form of governance for Sudan would be. And I think assumptions of what a democratic form of governance would be, but that didn't quite work out. And so can you give us a little bit of context about the transitional justice moment, but why that's also important to understand that moment, as well as having a large part to understanding how we also are here in this moment. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we can sum up the failure of Sudan's transition as a failure of governance, not just at the moment, the post-revolutionary moment, but it is an amalgamation of, different governance kind of systems and models that were never suitable for the political realities of Sudan, but also the medium through they were devised, kind of contributed directly to their quick disintegration. The fact that they were, exclusive, that they kind of catered to the needs and the priorities of the elites. The fact that they were kind of designed to ensure the entrapment of power and wealth creation amongst a small class of historically privileged Sudanese didn't help. And even at the moment of revolution, everything that Ismail had just said, the fact that change in Sudan, the end of the Islamic regime in Sudan, came about only because of these mobilizations that happened at the level of, that were only possible because of popular mobilization. Millions of Sudanese people taking the streets every day. And in the process, bearing the consequences of the violence of the machinery of the state, bearing the consequences of losing livelihood, of having their lives disrupted, mothers losing their children. And then over the course of 4 years or 5 years after Bashir was disposed, these popular forms of civic mobilizations continued to organize, to work diligently in order to produce an alternative ideal or idea, an alternative popular imaginary of a polity that would work for Sudan, was never taken into account when political machinations at the top were designing a governance system that would work for them with the help of, international system that perceives, democracy in very particular terms. It has to adhere and align with, the global political order. Mm-hmm. So the very idea of, I think Sudan is a prime example of how the very idea of good governance that we've been hearing about for decades now, since the new liberal turn, is not only inapplicable or tends to be a systematic failure, but it also contributes directly to the entrenchment of authoritarianism. In the case of Sudan, a transition to democracy through installing from above and from the outside governance systems led eventually to what Ismail described, the failure of reforming, the security system that eventually led to the war. It also didn't manage to kind of reconstitute the economic order to be more distributive and more egalitarian. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. I think it's important to understand when we talk about the current situation of food security during the war, and the fact that a lot of Sudanese people are on the verge of starvation, that this didn't happen overnight, that even in situations of conflict, communities do have means of resilience, but that was not the case in Sudan because the previous 3 or 4 years under transition had passed economic austerity measures that were so extreme, it pushed the majority of the Sudanese population into the threshold of emergency, food emergency. And so when the war happened, it was very easy for them to then, they were in the acute phase, and then it was very easy for them to be pushed into the emergency threshold. And so I think it's important to kind of try and understand the overall, but also the historic kind of aspect and process that led Sudan to where it is now, to understand revolution, conflict, as well as war, not as separate episodes or kind of, episodic kind of features in Sudan's tumultuous political history, but as connected and continuous processes, each one shaping the other. And if I have one moment left in this contribution, I would talk about the role of peace agreements, the role of peace as envisaged from the outside, the role of liberal peace in acting as a catalyst for war. In the case of Sudan, since 2000, Sudan has had as many peace agreements as Ismail said, we have armies. Maybe 4 or 5 major ones that required a lot of funding, a lot of intervention, and many smaller ones. None of them held. In fact, after every peace cycle, for those who are looking at, the kind of the political tectonics of Sudan's landscape, there is more contention. There is more contentious politics emerging. There is more fragmentation. There is more contentiousness, as different kind of, political groups now understand that peace has become a tool to be able to enter the state arena. It is a means of competition for state power, and with state power comes wealth. And so every time they sign a peace agreement, these groups, these armed groups, they're supposedly fighting for a cause, they break down, they fraction, they fragment, and then they form another bloc with a new leadership, more arms, and a new peace agreement that kind of diverts some of the state spoils to them. And in the end, it became such an established process, it became Sudan's politics. Sudan's politics now is the politics of the political marketplace, to use Alex Duval's term, which is basically a market arena, literally, where politics are bought and sold for those who can afford it. And in the language of Sudan, you afford to enter the political arena, the more violent you are. And the RSF is a prime example of that. If you can fight the state to kind of, wriggle a little bit more room space to enter, the power space, then so be it. And so I think there needs to be, when we talk about, Sudan's, revolution, when we talk about its war, when we talk about its conflict, there has to be also a recognition of all these kind of different political processes that happen kind of, in between, that lead to these kind of major moments.
Thank you so much. Just listening to you and Ismail, just kind of giving us that kind of perspective. I, as a South African, have picked up so many similarities, and I want Luvano to maybe help expand on that. So talking about transitional justice in South Africa and that moment of transition, right? How do we then get to the end of apartheid? We've also had conversations, or we know our history around the peace agreements. We also hear people talking about sort of compromises that were made so we can get to a specific place. But also, when I sort of heard you speak about Ismail, the June 3rd massacre and the committee that was put in place, that made me think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And I think right now we're also in a space where there's so much what we call unfinished business around there. And what is the consequence, again, of not doing that process properly, whether it's the transition to a democratic state, whether it is the moment of accountability, et cetera. And where are we as South Africans in relation to this? And I think, Luvano, you can help us with that.
Thanks, Ntombi. Yeah, so I think that phrase unfinished business quite captures it quite perfectly, because we have, this relatively, well, I would say contracted. It was quite a short period of time in which the negotiations were kind of happening. That was from around 1990, when political prisoners were released, and unbanning of political parties in South Africa by the National Party. And then we enter into that moment of the negotiations between, similarly, that kind of elite, right? I think there was this notion that who was at the negotiating table really held all the cards and all the power. And I think in a similar kind of way, when we are to understand who those key players are, if we reflect 30 years later, we see that legacy continuing, and that legacy of unfinished business, of not understanding who and what was decided and negotiated. It felt like a lot of things were happening behind closed doors. And I think a lot of that also has to do with what was happening in the 80s, right before we entered into that negotiation period. And so I think that, for one, there's this notion of international sanctions that had been imposed on the South African state, but also at the same time, the fact that there was a lot of sanctions busting going on at the same time by private interests. And so when we think about the infiltration of those interests who were funding the apartheid state, providing them with arms, then equally not being held to account for that, there are legacies of impunity that continue from that period onwards. And so when we enter into the TRC moment and what was happening, prior to that, because that was the TRC came about as a result of the negotiation process and the interim constitution that had been put in place. So when we come to that TRC moment, there's a lot to be dealing with and navigating. And you had spoken about how the legacy of colonialism is something that you'll touch on later in the series. That is also a massive part of why there's a lot that was left undone, like unfinished, because of that entrenchment of socioeconomic and structural harm. When we look at the fact that 30 years later, South Africa is one of the most, if not the most, unequal society in the world. And that comes from a lack of economic opportunity, disparities that we can be seen entrenched over decades and decades of segregation and colonial and apartheid rule. And so there are a number of things at play and a number of things that are investigated then by the TRC that the scope is not wide enough. The net is not cast wide enough to understand what it is that we are dealing with. And I think when we reflect on, the breakdowns in the peace negotiations from the beginning, there was a lot of violence that also took place in the 90s that I think has left a significant scar on our collective memory. And I think that's what we also are dealing with in South Africa, is that legacy of that collective memory of disrepair. And so while the TRC was a major proponent of uncovering the truths from 1960 to 1994, and investigating those human rights violations that had occurred, I think there's a lot that was left off the table. And that is the legacy of the things that we are also dealing with. So it is a structural harm. It is gender-based violence. It's the role of business in propping up authoritarian regimes, which we'll speak about a bit later, because I think that's also an important part of what both Raj and Ismail have kind of spoken about, is those interests that are at play. It's about wealth. It's about who is able to bring that power to the table and who is able to take that away at to the cost of and to the detriment of civilians. And so I think when we kind of think about the compromises and this negotiated settlement that we have now 30 years later, and how South Africa is still in many regards considered this like darling of what a transition to democracy can look like. The question is, next week when we vote, 30 years after the fact, 30 years of democracy, what are we going to say? What are the polls going to show? And that is this legacy of unfinished business. It's this legacy of there's no accountability, not just for apartheid era crimes, not just for colonial era crimes, but for contemporary crimes that are propped up by that system. And I think that was one thing that peace agreements and the negotiated settlement and the TRC did not and could not recognize. I think there was a much broader scope or much wider net that needed to be casted. And just to kind of reflect also very briefly on just that notion of what we're dealing with now. It's interesting in a conversation that we'd had yesterday around, if 30 years looks like this, what will the next 30 years look like? If we're to, think about these these promises that have gone unfulfilled. We're angry, we're broken, and I think it speaks to that legacy of intergenerational trauma that'll also maybe come back to, we'll come back to later in the conversation. And that is because we have a whole history that we've not addressed, an entire history, an entire memory that we are living with that we don't have words for quite yet yeah. So I think just very briefly, there's a lot to reflect on. And I think reflecting on transitional justice as a process in Sudan and in South Africa, I think will be such an interesting part of this conversation, to see its failures and, who is negotiating and who has the power really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Luvana, for that. I think for me, what's been very interesting is I am learning so much about Sudan, and because we've had several conversations before we get here. And I think sometimes in South Africa, not only is it we see ourselves as the darling, but it's like so inward facing, that we actually don't always understand that these are not just preoccupations that we have. These are preoccupations from the rest of the continent, and a lot of the stuff is linked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose two more questions to the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you want to prepare yourself for questions, you can raise your hand or you can pop questions into the chat box. Raj, I just want to come back to you, and I want us to talk about the cycles of revolution in Sudan. And can you just kind of, because we see it, right? Like we see it in the news historically, we kind of start to understand Sudan as a space of revolution. So if you can tell us about this and what has that meant for sort of like politics, because when we think about power to the people, we are seeing people, there's people who are going out to make these changes or to to want change or want reform. So two sort of things I want us to think about here is the cycles of revolution, but we also think about that idea of resilience and how Sudan and Sudanese people are often framed as very resilient because they've done this so many times, right? And that's also quite problematic and doesn't really understand how violent this notion of people being resilient is. It kind of stops, I think resilience is meant to be this kind of like soft thing and this, but it is violence that people are continuously, it's cycles of violence that people are continuously in. So if you can just talk to us about that in a sense. And I'm also interested because what does organizing look like right now in Sudan with what has happened, and how has the current war changed the nature of organizing and resistance? Yeah.
Well, I mean, Sudan's history of revolutions, as you said, is extensive and extended. In the national imaginary, and I'm going to the national imaginary, I'm just going to make a note of the terminology here. The national imaginary is different than the popular imaginary. National imaginary is led and sanctioned by the state. In the national imaginary, there are two past revolutions, and the 2018 one was the third. And the previous revolutions, as has this one, has brought into power the mainstream kind of political establishment, whether in both its kind of factions, whether it was the civilians and as well as the army, the armed actors. Maybe the addition to this new round was that the peripheral kind of rebels entered into the governance formula through a peace agreement. However, the kind of the setup remains the same. That the people who govern Sudan have always been the kind of descendants of this kind of historically kind of privileged class, who have certain kind of ethnic, kind of religious background in a kind of complicated setup that ties them up. And the national discourse, right, kind of speaks to them and to their culture. So it's kind of nation for them, made in their name. Back in 1924, before Sudan's independence, there was another revolution that is usually kind of overlooked, even though it does exist in the popular imaginary, led by people from outside of this establishment, right, who look and sound different, and because of that, they were never fully recognized. In between Sudan's independence, up until this moment, there've constantly been revolutionary kind of, moments and activities bubbling below the surface and above, that also have not been recognized or talking about, or kind of shut down, overlooked. And we're not just talking about the state in this case. I mean, even the Sudanese middle class, who have historically been the kind of self-proclaimed representatives of Sudan's major political junctures. They are also kind of complicit in kind of giving weight, value, and life to certain expressions of political discourse, while shunning others. And what makes the 2018 revolution exemplary, as opposed to all the previous ones, is that an alternative, branch, and with its imaginary of what it means to be Sudanese, these groups who have always been overlooked and downtrodden, and kind of, the right to center stage has always been kind of taken away. These people kind of, feature quite prominently in the 2018 revolution. At a cost, though, right? Because when the violence of the state kind of descends, it disproportionately affects them. It is them who now, when the incomplete transition that has led to the war, it is them who are now still on the ground in Sudan, having to deal with the everyday kind of chaos, as opposed to the middle class who has the means to exit a country and find itself a new home in the interim. And so, sorry, I forgot my train of thought. So yes, the history of multiple revolutions in Sudan is not just about the contentious relationship or the violent relationship between the state and the populace, but it's also a hierarchy where class, ethnicity, gender, and many other variables kind of feature prominently to kind of dictate the haves and the have-nots. And I think this was very kind of evident even in the slogans of the revolution, right? This continuity and the disruption. So the popular discourse, the more radical elements of it, they insist, on this continuity. They insist on acknowledging this kind of, this disrepair that is a product of, unfinished business. And as I said, it reflects in the revolution. So in the revolutionary slogans. So whilst, for example, the civic proponents of reform, which tend to be the middle class, kind of favor slogans like "Hanabnihu," which basically translates into "we will build it," meaning we've already got the space. Our national project is good, and it just requires a little tweaking. Whilst you have the other crowd, the majority, who are kind of, dispossessed, kind of, affected, historically overlooked, marginalized, they kind of premiere with the slogans that says, "Tas best. Let it all fall. Just let it fall. It's all decadent. It's all rotten." And then it becomes a kind of, a contention, a contested kind of, war of political expressions between even the members of, the civic space. And this kind of, goes on and reflects itself across the kind of, language and terminology of the revolution, right? So again, here, I want to sensitize those who are following the story of Sudan to also kind of try and push back against, the narrative that comes from the West. That democracy is about the army just being outside of politics. That it's about that democracy is just, kind of a civic representation of a state. Because even within, civic politics, there is kind of, a contention and kind of a struggle over who has full citizenship rights and who doesn't. And this was kind of, palpably kind of reflected in the nitty-gritties of the Sudanese revolution. And you could see them most clearly in the slogans. So also, while the middle class was saying, this is not a revolution of this is not a bread riot. This is not a bread revolution. This is a revolution for freedoms. You had people on the outskirts of Khartoum, the areas that are kind of more impoverished, protesting, marching, and chanting, "We are hungry." So how do you reconcile, these two kind of extremely opposing positions about what the revolution was about? Even within kind of, this civic bloc. So the revolution was not unified. The civic kind of logic of the revolution was not unified, and it did reflect in the language and the terminology. And perhaps just to make a kind of, to just say something about what you asked about, and Tombi, when it comes to terms like, resilience versus resistance. I mean, I would always prefer, so again, we were also talking about this yesterday. Resilience is a term that has kind of dominated the mainstream narrative when it comes to humanism, when it comes to the discourse of humanism, when it comes to humanitarianism, when it comes to development, when it comes to so in different aspects of national kind of welfare and growth, the term resilience is quite prominent, whereas the term resistance is kind of viewed, suspected with suspicion, right? There are certain connotations kind of slapped onto it, that it is its undertone is violent, that it would drive chaos, that it would drive disorder. That is only kind of that, I mean, in Sudan, the people who are kind of deemed to be kind of resisting were seen as troublemakers. I mean, even within the revolution at its height, you had the people who toed the line, and the people who they named themselves a bloc within the revolution that named themselves the angry ones, right? Because they used the language and the physical tools of resistance in an open way, and they were kind of labeled in problematic ways. They were labeled as extremists. But this is the modern order that we live under, right? That you're told that violence is not the way. That that civility, that if you are a civic member of this community, if you are a citizen of this country, there are better ways to go about asking for your rights or demanding change, right? That we live under a nation state or in a global order where there are processes, there are legal frameworks, there are mechanisms, and you shouldn't be barbaric. But they also forget that this entire system is violent, that it kind of, that on the outside, it looks orderly, it looks civil, right? And then it also kind of treats different groups in different ways. It might treat the middle class in a more civic way. I mean, this was also one of the major problems, for the civic bloc during the revolution, is that people's expressions and ideas towards the police as a force differed greatly. So in the more kind of affluent neighborhoods of central Khartoum, the police was kind of, an organizing force. These communities constantly wanted the police present in their neighborhoods to ensure kind of orderliness. On the outskirts, on the suburbs, right, where there was more poverty, the police was a violent kind of, agent of tax extraction. And so imagine how then the members of the same civilian bloc would approach the idea of a reform of a security institution when their ideas are so, vastly opposing because of how, these systems are made to treat one group versus the other. And it reflects in the terminology, right? These downtrodden groups, these groups that are kind of affected by the state violence, who are starving, whose children are being kind of killed and they're not given any compensation, where there's no any form of justice or transitional justice for them, they're told to be resilient. Rather than, and if they try and kind of adopt the language and process of resistance, then they're kind of, labeled in a particular way, they're targeted, they're labeled as terrorists, and so on and so forth. So I think we, as also the Sudanese middle class, I think as part of, being inducted into this moment of revolution, we need to consider how these terminologies are not, they're not void of meaning, right? They are political tools to achieving ends or means on behalf of a violent state, and as such should be treated with a lot of suspicion and pushback, which unfortunately didn't happen at this, during the 2018 revolution, as radical as it was, as magnificent and significant. So basically, we've picked up an unfinished revolution, and we still have so much to go, so much way to go in order to finish it. And I'm hoping that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we try and start a new project while burying the old. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So much resonates. And I'm just going to ask Lubano to kind of pick up some of the same conversations, right, around resistance and protest action and stuff. Pre-94, we kind of see how important this becomes in one part of what then becomes the end of apartheid. In this contemporary sense, we are dealing with so many of the similar things that Raja was talking about, right? So we see on our end, we see people protesting and we see all this call for reform. Seems like it's happening more in pockets, because I suppose, again, these things are around class, they're quite gendered, they're around all these different things, like geography, location, et cetera, right? But I think the post-2010 moment is interesting around even state violence and police violence. We have those service delivery protests in Vicksburg where Andrew Stadani is killed. We have the Marikana massacre. We have the student protests that we start seeing. And then most recently, we had the unrest as well in Phoenix and in Durban. And just so the question is, I want to just think about our history of protests and also where do we sit now? So it does seem like we do see pockets of it. And even if we don't always read about it in the news, we know that people will always use this as a tool, but it doesn't always impact change or lead to like the change that we actually need. And just even these ideas around the language, right, as well, and how people who protest and who also like maybe burn things down, are often seen as the violent ones. And the idea that you can do this in a neater way, you can do this in a bit of a polite way. Why don't you go and vote, use your vote, when the system itself is what is violent, as Raja was saying. So can you just talk about a little bit about in terms of our history and where we find ourselves now around organizing and protesting and reform? Yeah.
Thanks, Ndombi. So I mean, South Africa has a very extensive history of protest, to a point where at some stage we were I don't know for how many years it was, but we were one of the protest capitals of the world, because I think there was 10 or so protests happening about different things every day. And so that measure, I think, can be looked at within a broader spectrum of what protesting has looked like. And I think when we reflect again back on the kind of apartheid colonial moment, there was a lot of peaceful protests, a lot of peaceful resistance. Mobilizing was around, that kind of very symbolic kind of acts, sit-ins, burning of passbooks, those sorts of things that, were, I mean, the kind of idea was that liberation movements didn't want to antagonize even further a brutal system. And so that moment kind of changed significantly in our history with the Sharpeville massacre, which was very much mirrored by the Marikana massacre in 2012. And so I think from that point on, the nature of resistance became a lot more militant, a lot more violent, especially because now resistance liberation movements were banned. And so a lot of organizing had to happen underground. And so I think that kind of created there was this creation of this culture of, violence needs to be the appropriate response to violence. But then it also became this combination of both peaceful and violent kind of protest. And so we see this throughout South Africa's history. I think what becomes very evident is that, especially when we get now to the 80s, when we have our states of emergency that are applied at different points in the 80s, that it also allows the state to become even more brutal in their response to protests for civic rights, as well as economic freedoms and those sorts of things. So I think there is this notion that South Africa has had a very long, very robust history of protest. And kind of that as Gigi, we're not turning, you can't move us. We are very much set on securing our freedom. And I think this kind of revolutionary spirit was very much evident throughout our history. And I think now when we reflect on protests in the last 30 years and how that's changed, so now you no longer have this apartheid regime in place, but rather you have a democratically elected government. And as such, the assumption is that also the military, and because part of the transitional justice process is also the reform of military and police institutions. And so now it's about the protection of rights and civic rights, as opposed to being that violent repressive force. But that's not how militaries and police systems operate. And we can see that across the world. It's not just unique to South Africa. And so I think each moment in which you have these protests, that somewhat also, like you're saying, Dombi, because it feels like they're happening in pockets, it almost feels like it's removed from a calling out a systemic issue. Because when you're burning passbooks and in the same breath, you're also, bombing, whatever buildings that represent the apartheid state, it all seems like you're targeting a very specific repressive state. But now protests about GBV, as well as fees, as well as fees must fall, sorry, for our other listeners, fees must fall, roads must fall, service delivery, it all feels like it's in pockets and very disjointed from what the actual cause is, and that is systemic injustice. And so I think that one of the difficulties that we've had around organizing and protest is that after 2 or 3 weeks, when it dies down, when the police have had their way, arrested people, in many instances killed people, it kind of disappears. The news cycle moves on to the next thing, whatever's happening, often leaving us in the lurch. We don't know what's next. And then what often happens is, because we are in a we're under a democratic elected government, a member of the government will say, we're going to address these issues, service delivery, gender-based violence, whatever it is, making these wild claims, these wild promises, and then whatever solutions are put out there have no real effect, because they don't address the structural issue. And oftentimes they're not directly engaging with civil society, civic society, the people who are actually, calling for these reforms. And I think it's really difficult to kind of think about how we can sustain protests into longer and meaningful change when we are constantly brutalized, not just physically, but now we're silenced, because silencing is this whole other form of repression that exists within our society. And you're kind of throwing scraps to be like, okay, a member of government will come and address you. It's a similar thing of ongoing conversations around the reparations struggle for reparations for apartheid era victims that came out of the TRC. There's ongoing protests around who are the victims of that, and it's a very contested kind of topic. But I think it speaks to a very clear cause that there are questions, and when we protest asking these questions, we are met with brutality each and every single time. And this is also enacted by our democratically elected government. And I keep saying that because the idea is that once you have democracy, you have your rights. And that is not the case. I think we can look at authoritarian regimes and point fingers and like, that's bad. But then, in a similar way, we are experiencing our own form of brutality. So I think we have a long history of protest and of struggle. And I think our imaginary around what liberation looks like. What Raja was saying about the kind of like freedom versus bread protests in Sudan, I think that's a really interesting thing because it's kind of like those two things are so necessary. And I think we kind of have a similar discourse going of, that kind of happened, like that peace versus justice. Things are so binaric, and it's really hard to break out of what comes first, and like what does liberation actually look like. And I think protests will continue to happen in pockets because they are so divided. I mean, South Africa is extremely segregated to this day, and that is reflected in what our causes are and what we fight for and how we organize.
Thank you so much. I have a final question. Thank you so much for that perspective. Yeah, there's so many similarities, and I think just thinking about, again, you mentioned, Luvano, we're going to the voting polls next week, and it's like, but the week after then, or the month after then, or a year after then, will there be any change? We'll still be seeing these cycles, right? So I think I want to talk about the idea of we think a lot about the interference of kind of like foreign interests. And a lot of the time when we talk about it, it's the West, right? But South Africa is actually one of those countries that has interfered in many places in the continent in different ways that has also undermined the idea of democracy. But before we get there, Ismail, as a journalist, I just want you to talk to us a bit about someone who works within the media and the perception of sort of like South Africa as this kind of democratic space, but South Africa was like the country that took Israel to the ICJ, which was so necessary and so important. But what then happens with what's happening in Sudan? And maybe you can talk about the silence, but it's not really silence, right? Because we have seen Cyril Ramaphosa with Mohammed Dagalo from the RFS, and we have seen almost an alignment in a sense that while one does not even have to articulate what's happening in words, but the imagery of what we are seeing is silence, right, and what's happening. And that's a huge contradiction around what we are seeing as our push for sort of like change in sort of Palestine, which is important. And it is so important, again, I repeat, that we took Israel to the ICJ, but what does that mean? How do we hold that while also thinking about the role of Sudan in the role of South Africa in Sudan, or the government, and how that is perceived, how the government's actions affirm a specific kind of faction, perhaps, and how that is quite harmful. And then Raja and Luvano, maybe you can actually talk about the interference of whether it's the South African government or South African businesses into Sudan at the moment, and how this is a question of what's happening economically, or economic interest, but also why this also undermines the democratic process. And then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
Well, I mean, the imagery of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, Hameti, meeting with the presidency of in South Africa, I think really raised eyebrows, to say the least. It is one thing if the South African government was involved in some sort of peace negotiations in Sudan, meeting with the different actors in the Sudan conflict. But to meet with someone like Hameti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, which is responsible for many atrocities in Sudan, in Darfur, I think sends a negative message. And this wouldn't be the first time that the government in South Africa meets with someone, a representative of the Sudanese military establishment, that is targeted for their transgressions. In 2015, Omar al-Bashir was in South Africa, who was then wanted by the ICC. But the South African government did not act upon the arrest. And we can debate, we can discuss and debate, all of the role of the ICC in Africa and all of that. But again, I think in terms of image, this just sends I think the wrongs to a government that many, or to the view of a country, I think, that has always been seen as on the forefront of justice issues, coming after the decades of apartheid. So I think that definitely I think just was something that I think many in South Africa, I think, have to question why these acts, and what are the underpinnings and behind the scenes um, relations as to why there was this kind of meeting. Interestingly, I mean, and I know Raja will be talking about more of the economic and business, but I mean, just coincidentally today, MTN resumed its services in Sudan, after, not to say that, this is but just the coincidence is somewhat humorous. But I think, yes, I mean, I think, what role does the government in South Africa play on the continent, I think, is something that I think people in South Africa should be, beyond, I think, the rhetoric of justice. But I mean, there are other issues, I think, that we need to be seriously looking at. I mean, journalistically, I mean, the question that you always raise is, follow the money. And I think that's something that I mean, we would have to look into.
Amazing, thank you. Raja, can you help us expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, Ismail there ended it on a perfect note, right? It's about the money, follow the money, right? And the truth is that, kind of the fact that the kind of world order is changing because new hegemons are arising. The Gulf is kind of emerging as a major hegemon in the region. One with, and the kind of economic leverage, but also kind of, diplomatic ties to the West that allows it to kind of step in into the continent, and kind of rework kind of, regional and kind of, bloc foreign policy, foreign international relations. And I think this is what happened in the case of South Africa receiving Hemeti as a statesman, because some sort of deal was struck behind closed doors that was, paid for lucratively. And South Africa is not alone in that. I mean, South Sudan's position on the Sudanese war, the Chadians as well. The fact that, this war has been going on for more than a year at the level and intensity that that is, maybe recently unprecedented around the world, and that Sudan's neighbors kind of look on, whilst less than 20 years ago, they had more kind of proactive and positive intervention in the North-South war. Says a lot about what kind of, first of all, the kind of negative turn of politics in the region, where it's all about, that is defined by transactionalism and politicking. I get this, I take that, and I mean, and I develop a position on that basis. But also the fact that, South Africa is, a contender in a global capitalist system, where it also requires this, it needs to strike the right kind of deals with the people who have the right kind of money in order to kind of challenge, historic colonial, new colonial systems that continue to put it in this undermined position, right? I mean, South Africa's internal kind of transition to democracy requires it to achieve, financial kind of independence and superiority at a level that this system doesn't allow. And so what happens is then you get a situation where the kind of second world, what they call, second world countries, as opposed to first and third, which are countries that are kind of, have a degree of, economic, military, and political kind of weight, such as South Africa, Russia, Morocco, and they get together to kind of develop some sort an economic bloc that rivals the kind of, the standard kind of Western one. In order to be able to do that, they need backing. They need backing of heavy players. And more recently, the UAE has joined the BRICS, right? Which is makes sense for obvious economic reasons. But the political implications of these group of countries coming together in some sort of economic agreement is bound to be problematic for the larger continent, whose economic position is basically less, right? Countries like Sudan and South Sudan and Congo, countries that are struggling with poverty and conflict, and will be at the exploitative ends of these kind of emerging hegemons. And so this is something that, I mean, I'm not sure how our kind of existing systems and discourse of democracy addresses these new turns. And the discussion also extends to the role of Pan-Africanism, right? And regional African institutions, as one of the participants asked. I mean, these institutions, they are African in name, sure. And at some point, yes, they were kind of established on the basis of a Pan-Africanist project that unfortunately no longer exists. And in the last 20, 30 years, they function as per the world order logic that is driven and funded by the West. I mean, the AU, the IGAD, they require, in order to be functional and present at the level that, that these kind of conflicts in these countries require, they require a degree of funding that is long kind of, dried up. Not to mention, of course, the internal kind of regional politicking and how that also shapes the political positions of different kind of countries, voting countries in these regional systems. So, all these things kind of play a major role.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Luvano, similarly, can you also give us that perspective within South Africa, what South Africa is doing in Sudan at the moment?
I think that, it's kind of interesting because from, one perspective, South Africa has been called countlessly to participate in peacekeeping missions across the continent, which is one thing. But I think when we think about, the violation of human rights, it's also important to think about the role that business plays. And I'm very, curious, and I think a big question has come up around like MTN's operations in Sudan. And MTN has been operational in Sudan since I think it's 2005. So this is now towards the end of the I think it set up operations just before the civil war came to an end. And so I think that is just, it's kind of like the implications of setting up operations and pursuing business in such a fractured time is really curious. And I think at the time also, Cyril Ramaphosa was the chair of MTN. And so I think that's really interesting to think about those linkages. And I think, from that point, Sudan has also undergone countless internet shutdowns, of which MTN has also participated in, whether, these were attacks. I mean, the RSF denies, in this most recent shutdown, which began in February of this year, I think it was, the RSF denied that it was involved in attacking that infrastructure. But I think it is very questionable that South African business can continue to operate in conflict zones in under authoritarian regimes, taking orders from these regimes to shut down the internet. I think there's a massive implication for what this means for the rights of civilians, how those will be violated in those contexts. And I think it calls into question what role we play as South Africa in holding these businesses to account. I think that there's a real question of what then happens to a company like MTN, whose board is based in South Africa. Those sorts of questions around what are you doing there? What is accountability going to look like in those contexts? And also, there's also that equally uncomfortable thing that our colleagues were speaking about around, Hemeti coming to South Africa, but at the same time also knowing that Hemeti and the RSF has this relationship with the UAE and was also part of the massive military attack in Yemen, killing thousands of civilians in that war as well. I think it's very problematic. We have to think about those linkages around what our alliances and what our business interests ultimately, not just, our telecoms, but also drilling for oil, whatever, mining, all those things around sustaining the war economy, what that means for South Africa, that is, again, this darling democracy. I think it's very problematic to think that we have dealings and operations in these contexts. And I think we need to really, and that's part of also our work that we're currently looking into is what do we do with South African businesses such as MTN that are operating in these and what accountability looks like. Because I think that also calls into question what we do in solidarity with Sudanese people who are asking the same kinds of questions. So that's, I think, part of the broader conversation that we'll get into is around what solidarity efforts look like in this context.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So we're going to open it up. We're going to allow a few questions. So let's take 4 questions from raised hands. Or should we just maybe go to the chat? I'm going to just pose a few questions from the chat. And then we can ask, our speakers can ask. So Peter van Heesden. Can you hear?
Sorry, and there's a hand up, I think. Sorry, because you just said we will take.
Okay, there is a hand up. So maybe let me read this question and then we'll take the hand up. And then because I can't see all the hands. So if you are given the mic, just introduce yourself and then you can ask your question. So Peter asks, firstly, thank you for organizing the series and hashtag Keep Eyes on Sudan. The speakers speak eloquently about the role of colonialism as a common thread between South Africa, Sudan, DRC, Palestine, etc. How can this understanding be energized to help build bridges when to many South Africans, Sudan seems so far away? Would you like to, anyone want to speak on that? Isma, will you help us with take that one for us?
Right. I mean, I think the idea of places being far away really no longer, I mean, is that applicable. What is happening in Sudan with the amount of refugees that that the conflict has produced, the impact that it has in its immediate region, I think will eventually, I mean, to say the least, I mean, will have its impact on the continent. This, if we are not looking at it from the lens of Pan-Africanism, but what happens in Sudan is not going to only impact Sudan or Sudanese, but it will have an impact on the region. I mean, we were just talking about the involvement or the role of South African businesses in Sudan, and this is not to say that they are immediately involved in the conflict, but the issues on communications, information, disinformation, where that comes to play the stake of a South African citizen in what is happening in Sudan, I think, is more immediate than many would realize. I mean, once upon a time, Sudan was the largest country on the continent. And with the separation and independence of South Sudan, because of the failure of Sudanese politics to deal with the issues of diversity, there are lessons, I think, from this that throughout the continent can be learned. I mean, these issues of managing diversity, the unequal development in the country, I think are themes that repeat themselves on the continent. And I think from that lens, to say the least, I think is where I would imagine many would be interested in following what is happening in Sudan.
On that, is there a hand? Can we take someone's question? Okay, so please introduce yourself and you can pose your question. Thank you. Okay, we can't. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much for this event. Thank you, Raja. Nice to see you again. Thank you all. I love South Africa, and I really that this is the country that we can look up to, we can work with, and would like to hear more from. I would very quickly start by saying that when I heard the kind of interventions by the participants, I had the feeling that this is Sudan's unfinished revolution. If only we had the class system away from this and the civil kind of the neoliberal connotations of the middle class away, and we bring only the poor and the marginalized to lead this revolution, everything would have been better. If you see the landscape now and what is happening in the aftermath of the 15th of April 23, you will find that, Raja, you talked about Alex Dual's political marketplace. I thought that, Alex Dual did actually take out the international dimension from the peace agreements. What his analyses are based on are that, these Inqaziyin and the Islamists are taking the money and buying loyalties from all these people who are now holding arms and saying that they are part of the peace agreement and would like to have a big chunk of things. When you juxtapose this kind of thesis by Alex Dual with Sharaf's Srinivas when he skills politics, Sharaf actually deciphered many cables and communications between the British embassy in Khartoum and the parliament and the UK government, and between the American embassy in Khartoum and Congress, Capitol Hill, you name it, in the US. They give you page by page, verbatim, the kind of influence and intervention in Sudanese peace. Has nothing to do with the Islamists only. Maybe the Islamists as opportunist people, as people who are actually despotic with their ideology, they actually avail the space. But the international intervention and international manipulation of the peace process, to the extent that Darfur was raging and actually there was a genocidal kind of resolution in the shape of 51 and 56 and 95, nothing happened. And they actually went along and assisted the independence of the South. We are really glad that the Southerners got what they wanted. But we need to remember that peace and politics are not actually fitting together properly. And the Juba Peace Agreement, by virtue of which those kind of, the Revolutionary Front maintain power sharing and some kind of wealth sharing, that Juba Peace Agreement left away a whole region called the Eastern Sudan with its naval bases competed for by the United States, by Turkey, and by Russia. The Juba Peace Agreement cannot be taken just like that. We need to actually unpack what is happening with peace agreements. When we see the poverty-stricken Sudanese and the number of people under the poverty line in Sudan before the war, and when we come now at the crisis in the humanitarian situation, as Mbeki reminded us in November from the humanitarian conference in Cairo, November 2023. That kind of resemblance of what is happening will tell you that the Sudanese were not actually having a large and vast middle class. People were impoverished, and now the crux of the matter is that 18 million people are actually on acute chronic hunger. Some 5 million children will die. In Karma yesterday, tens of people died. In Zamzam, 2 children die every day. And Al-Fash, at the last episode of a long war for toll, is actually staring us in the face. If you want to say that we are having some kind of problem of a vacuum, then you have to have a constitution, maybe with some kind of rights, maybe with some kind of egalitarian space where people will come and be all recognized as human beings and as citizens. And from that vantage point and that threshold, you will come to realize that Sudanese who died at the sit-in were from middle-class people. People who are now with this army and the RSF are very impoverished. People from the regions and people from the middle regions of Sudan called Mustanfarin, they are constricted to come and fight for themselves, to defend themselves, livelihoods and lives, etc. There is some kind of a chaos that will give you a very neat description of what is happening in Sudan defies class, ethnicity. I heard you, Rajab, before you said that ethnicity in Sudan is just a marker. The war is not on ethnic basis. But now I think you may realize that now everything is based on ethnicity. If the RSF is commanding and actually talking about all these kind of formidable forces joining them, and the amount of relentless supply, the UAE and others, by the way, including the UK government, who sells arms until 2022, then you find that it is not only class or the Islamists or the Sudanese or the Africans. Now this is a big kind of geopolitical arena with the coast and the natural resources and the gold in the center. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Raja, do you want to respond or add anything to that? Or?
Oh, no, I mean, hi, Iman. So lovely that you on this call and listening to us. And I completely agree with everything you have to say. I just wanted to make a disclaimer that when I said that ethnicity is just a marker, I said it in the context that the state, it's a state construct. The national project as envisaged by the state in Sudan, we kind of constituted the kind of this hierarchy along ethnic lines. So it's very much like a present kind of and real variable that drives, right? It's just that it's not real, it's been constructed by the state, but it's very real. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. I think, when you talk about the hierarchy along ethnic lines, that is something we know so well here in South Africa. And again, we actually want to also have that conversation in one of the later webinars. But again, we see the similar sort of things happening here. Do we have any other hands up? Over there? Okay, so we have another question, which is, in a system where only states can wield violence and civic actors must only use resilience rather than active or violent resistance, how can more states be engaged to echo civic resistance? Work example seen with South Africa in the case of Gaza. Does anyone want to share thoughts on that?
I mean, I could just contribute a quick kind of response. I think maybe that the case of Gaza is quite exceptional, right? I mean, it is a genocide unfolding in front of our eyes. And I don't think the same case can be made, let's say, for other countries that are going through kind of internal wars. The exceptionalism of the Gaza case and the intervention of South Africa, specifically, from all the countries of the world, has to do with the fact that what's happening in Palestine is settler colonialism of the type that doesn't exist anymore, right? And that's why it's so offensive to all our senses. And this is also why South Africa is leading on this, because it's the last country to have, to have emerged out of this nightmare. I think that, unfortunately, in the case of Sudan, which is a story of internal conflicts and wars, yes, with external intervention, so the new colonialism and whatnot, sister state interventions would be different. And I'm afraid that these same states in their own countries are engaging in similar problematic acts of divide and conquer, right? They are engaged in acts of undermining democracy. They are engaged in acts of curtailing civic space. So I don't see how other states would kind of promote civic resistance in other countries. I mean, even in the case of the most democratic of them, right? I mean, I'm still utterly shocked and appalled by the fact that Britain is trying to export people who are asking for protection to an African country for a price, right? I mean, and it's the British who are the hardest to kind of, preach human rights and democracy and whatnot. I don't trust the British state to echo civic resistance in Sudan. It won't, because it kind of undercuts whatever kind of project it has to maintain a global order with a minority elite. But I could say that, the echoing of civic resistance happens from communities towards other communities. And in the case of Gaza, right, it was the world saying, actually, that's not terrorism. That's armed resistance. That's a liberation movement, kind of, acting to liberate themselves from occupation. That is, that's a moment of community to community kind of, activating civic resistance. I mean, I don't know. I have more kind of, hope in communities helping each other, as opposed to, states intervening, with democracy narratives or kind of, good governance projects, in the way that's the standard approach.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add on that? Any other person? Okay. All right. Another question we have is, what resources, approaches, and strategies are currently being used by various role players in addressing the plethora of trauma, and what should be prioritized? I think this is definitely something for both nations. Yeah. Yeah, Luvano.
I think that, there are a series of ways in which we're seeing how, and this kind of goes back to the point of solidarity, I think. And let me just put up the question so I kind of feel like I'm addressing all of it. But I think it kind of goes back to that question of solidarity. And I think that we've seen increasingly the use of social media to, one, illuminate what's happening across the globe, but also how it's being utilized as a resource to also, so it operates in kind of both ways. I think that one thing that we saw, for instance, with the ICJ hearings last year was around beginning of this year, time. So basically how evidence was used, what was put on TikTok can also be submitted, as like evidence. So seeing how those powerful platforms can also be used to raise funds and those sorts of things, raise awareness, also put us in community and connection with each other. I think an earlier question that was asked and that Isma kind of answered was around, what is happening in this room is that you have people from different societies kind of gathering together to be in conversation. And I think that's a really effective strategy, because then we can learn what works best and because I think often we can kind of put ourselves out there, especially as South Africans, be like, oh, this is, this might be what works best because they've kind of been spotlighted as those leaders. But I think it's really important for us to not teach the lessons, but to also learn what is most effective in terms of those resources. I think journalism is a powerful investigative tool, investigative journalism. You have a whole bunch of media houses which are making use of things like satellite imagery to actually show what's going on the ground. So we're not just hearing by word of mouth, we're seeing evidence, because especially in a time of misinformation and disinformation, we're kind of seeing in real time what it can look like for narratives to be co-opted to tell us lies about what's going on. So I think investigative journalism is really important. I think we've seen mediums like art and activism being utilized, encampments across the globe, those sorts of things to raise awareness. And I think that's a way in which we can all engage with each other to talk about that legacy that we all share, which is, colonial and imperial kind of expansion, how that's affected all of us, but also the prospect and potential for what we envision our futures to look like, especially if we are thinking Pan-African, especially if we are thinking, that kind of solidarity. It goes down to that simple thing of, how are we engaging with each other? And I think other speakers can speak to other things, but I think that one thing I've really noticed is just how powerful gathering can be in this kind of context to learn more.
Do any of the speakers want to add to that question?
Maybe just to add to the point that Luvana made about the role of investigative journalism. After the Sudanese war erupted, a group of veteran Sudanese journalists who also come from a tradition of kind of radical writing and leftist politics came together and started this magazine that they publish weekly. And it's on, it's not just on the war per se. It's about, it's basically Sudanese voices, during the war. And I think it's important because it kind of addresses the gap in humanitarian reporting that's usually dominant at times like this, right? Where it is the crisis, right? And its political implications that are kind of centered rather than the people, right? So the way the standard humanitarian reporting is X amount of people are starving in this camp, and if there's no intervention, again, right? It kind of couches it in the term that, there's a catastrophe, right, in this country, and the international community has the upper hand to act. And I think this kind of reporting has come at a major consequence and has kind of contributed to the cycles of kind of, disrepair. Because we come out of every violent cycle, right, with this idea, especially if we're kind of removed from that context, that this is just a country where, bad things happen, right? These people are just problems and they have problems, right? The kind of journalism I'm trying to highlight here, and the magazine is called Atar, and thankfully they've just started producing English versions, is that it's really kind of, it's humanizing the conflict. Sorry, maybe humanizing the conflict isn't the right word, but it's kind of, it's couching the trauma in human terms, right? It's the people talking about their crisis, right? They're using their language, beautiful Sudanese prose for the Arabic version, right? People talking about how this is affecting them and how they're kind of, really kind of working around it, right? How they're dealing with the situation. To be honest, reading that magazine weekly when it comes out is also like it's a form of kind of, it's one way I kind of address my ongoing trauma relating to the Sudanese war in a kind of, in kind of a short-term sense, right? Just kind of learning about what the people in Sudan are doing, what's affecting them, kind of hearing them speak, for themselves, by themselves, about, their daily realities, their aspirations, how they deal with it. I think, in that sense, the kind of reporting done, the way that it's done, the language that is used is kind of, really tends to kind of have, tends to really kind of, have major implications. And I don't think, I don't know what to say about it, but I think there's generally kind of, a problem with discourse creation that is old as these intervention systems and as problematic as pieces, to kind of follow up on what Iman said, that needs to be addressed by these alternative forms of reporting, right? And I think we can only kind of come to the right terms, arrive at the right terms to describe their importance once we experience them. And that's what happened in my case after I read Etter. I've experienced kind of knowledge about conflict in a different way I'm sorry, I don't have the right words to describe or explain just yet. But it has been kind of, it's been healing, basically, what I'm trying to, even during the trauma.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I think you've raised some really interesting things. We have seen in the situation currently in Palestine and how the reporting on that has kind of shown that the media and the journalism that we've looked to for decades cannot always be trusted to give us sort of like the honesty that we need. But you, Luvano and Raja, you've spoken about all these other different methods in which people themselves are making sure that these stories sort of come out, and I think the intention of this hopefully is to also I like the fact that this is quite intergenerational, right? And also we're not just looking at South Africa, Sudan. It's very intergenerational because there's so many ways of imagining and thinking through these things together, and we must when we think about solidarity. And so to just wrap us off so we can end our conversation, I would love to think about, because reimagination is kind of one of the methodologies we like to think about when thinking through the work. So how can we reimagine new pathways to freedom? I mean, at first I was thinking about this idea of democracy, but I don't know if democracy is what we need, or do we need to understand a different, or rethink it, or rethink the language around what kind of democracy we need. But when we think about a pathway to freedom, what do you guys envision in terms of our continent, but like Sudan, South Africa? Yeah. Raja, we'll start with you. We'll just go, I'm just literally going from top to bottom. So, yeah.
I mean, I would say, at the risk of, sounding, like anarchist, I would say people's power. Right? And I know that the world we're living in doesn't have, the propensity to kind of imagine what people's power looks like, right? Because it's got this kind of narrow vision of order that's tied to a central authority, which is the state. And I think freedom, or kind of, arriving at freedom, requires us to kind of decenter, this idea of a central authority, and kind of imagine a diffused form of, association, political association, or diffused form of kind of power that is kind of instilled in the individual and balanced vis-a-vis the other. Now, what that looks like in terms of, the outcome, I'm not sure, but it's definitely a place to start. But I also want to say that if we're thinking in that way, if we're thinking in terms of the people's power, then naturally, the representation system, of modern democracy, which is all about elections, becomes pointless.
Thank you so much. Luvano, what is your perspective on new pathways to freedom?
I think it's similar, and I don't want to, I think it's actually interesting. So our offices are based in Community House, which has always been a massive space for organizing in Cape Town, and also has this like kind of place in our imagination around what it looks like to organize as people. And I think it's this idea that people's power, but also, how do we imagine ourselves not just what is this, you can envision a future, but do you see yourself also living in that future? I think it's like the systems that are created can also be undone. So we should not be afraid to undo, and we should not be afraid to be creative and think, okay, this might sound crazy, but in 1600, no one was questioning them when they were also coming up with, like, we can equally be, and if not more, and powerfully so, be creative and imagine and have that imagination. I think there are so many groups who are constantly silenced, and I think we kind of are we kind of are silenced in the sense of, like, democracy kind of subsumes your rights into, like, one document that assumes that, like, we're all seen as human equally across the board, which is not the case. So I think when we start having those real conversations about disrupting, who is seen as human, who is not, and why is that the case, and how do we create the human again in a way that is a future that we want to live in. And I think that's really powerful. So it's difficult because sometimes you run the risk of sounding like ridiculously idealistic and optimistic, but I think it's very possible to imagine a future in which we live, and it's a future that you're proud of creating because you have had a say in it, not, voted someone into power that pretends to care, but that you yourself have a vested interest in it. And that it comes from the people, it comes from all of us. We all have a vested interest in making society better and work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Ismail, you will end us off and tell us what your idea of reimagined pathways to freedom is.
It is difficult to be somewhat optimistic on Sudan. Just observing the events. I mean, as we speak, fighting in Darfur, around the capital of Darfur and Fashir, is taking place. This war, I think, more than any other event, made many of us think that the possible unraveling of the Sudanese state, as we know it. If there is one positive thing to take out, I think, of this experience is to see where past agreements, I think, have failed. I mean, as was mentioned, as Raja mentioned, I mean, this series of agreements, of peace agreements, and I had mentioned earlier about the multiple military coups that have taken place. I mean, obviously, I think more than any other time, that there is something wrong with how politics is practiced. And I think we need to reimagine how what it means to have a country, a state where all can participate in designing its future. When will that take place in Sudan? I honestly cannot say, because, as I mentioned, I think this has been one of the most, I think, serious episodes in modern Sudanese political history. I think that really questions, the very root of the founding of the state, 200 years ago. The modern nation state and how it was formed. I think the only positive thing that I can think of is that there needs to be a very serious reimagining of how politics is practiced in Sudan. And I hope that that's something that those who are involved in shaping the future of the country can take that into account.
Thank you so much. And we've come to the end of this webinar. I want to say thank you so much to everyone. Lots to think about, but I think I feel a little bit hopeful just in the community of solidarity that we are building, even if it's just around understanding that we actually are not that far away from each other, and we talk about Pan-Africanism, and I think it's a good moment for us to think about what that looks like in these contemporary times. Thank you so much, Raja. Thank you, Luvano. Thank you, Ismail. I also want to say thank you to my fellow organizers, so Chanel, Eva, and Isra. We have been thinking about this for a very long time. It's been amazing to get going. We have so much more coming in the next few months. We're exploring written pieces, we're exploring digital advocacy. We are going to make this link available and circulate it from next week, and we'll have another conversation in the next month. But we really want to just encourage people to be in conversation with us. So you can sign up for our mailing list if you email info@tutu.org.za, and we'll share all the information around how you can also be involved in this conversation. Have a good afternoon, and we will hopefully be in conversation and community soon. Thank you.